Weekly SA or at AgriSA1904, and we are using the hashtag WEF Nexus for today's discussion. So you're welcome to join us there, and to also post any questions or comments there. We will be looking at that to follow up on that. But over now to Janse Rabie, who is just going to give a quick formal welcome before we jump straight into the presentations. Good morning, Janse.
Good morning, Deneen. Thank you for that excellent introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Janse Rabie. I'm head of AgriSA's Natural Resources Centre of Excellence, and on behalf of my committee, I wish to welcome you to this webinar on the Water-Energy-Food Nexus. AgriSA, for those of you who don't know, is the largest or the biggest agricultural federation in the country. We've been around since 1904. Our members consist of provincial affiliates, commodity organisations and corporate members. We've been around for a while now, and we certainly plan on being around for a while longer. We live in a very complex society, in a very complex world, in a particularly complex time in the history of mankind, if I could put it that way. And this complexity requires that we start thinking about our actions and our interactions with one another and with nature in a different way. This is really a survival issue. I'm very much looking forward to the topics and the discussions this morning. A particular word of welcome to you again, Professor Midgley, Professor Mabaodi, and Dr. Lunamu. And with that, over back to you, Deneen. Thank you for your facilitation as well.
Thanks, Janse. Yes, I'm also very much looking to the presentations. So let's jump straight into them. As I said, our first presenter today is Professor Stephanie Midgley. She is a scientist in climate change and risk assessment at the Department of Agriculture in the Western Cape. She also has 30 years experience in botanical, agriculture and climate change research in South Africa and the Southern African region. She also led the team that developed the Smart Agri Plan for the Western Cape agricultural sector. Professor Midgley's topic for today is the dynamics of the water-energy-food nexus at household and farm level in South Africa. Good morning, Professor Midgley.
Good morning, Deneen. Good morning, Janse. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody listening in today. If you'll allow me to just share my screen again.
Yes, please, you can go ahead and share your screen, and then you are welcome to take the floor and run us through your presentation.
There we go. Is that visible?
Yes.
Right, lovely. Yes, thank you to AgriSA and Farmers Weekly for this invitation to participate in the webinar, and I look forward to the discussion. So in my presentation, I will first give a brief description of the Water-Energy-Food Nexus framework and the approach for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Next, I want to describe some of the Nexus interlinkages applicable at the farm level in South Africa, followed by some results of a study that was conducted on the Nexus at household level using the Sustainable Livelihoods approach. And then I'll close with some thoughts on whether the WEF Nexus approach is useful at this scale within agricultural and rural contexts. So to start with, just a bit of background. I think some of my colleagues might explain a little bit more about where the WEF Nexus came from, but in essence, it was developed in the build-up to the 2015 United Nations Sustainable Development Conference, from which the Sustainable Development Goals arose. But without going into too much detail about the history, really where it comes from is that water, energy, and food are essential for human societies at all scales. But we are increasingly, over the last few decades, we're seeing increasing insecurity of both water, energy, and food at all scales. And this is driven by amongst others, unsustainable economic development, by population growth, poverty and urbanization, by climate change, and by resource degradation and scarcity. In South Africa, we all are very aware of the fact that our water and energy sectors are highly stressed, and also there's higher food insecurity in parts of the country, in certain portions of the population. So the important part about the Nexus is that the three Nexus components are inextricably interlinked and interdependent. And it's really important that changes in the availability, use, and affordability of each of the three components can either help or harm the other two components. So decision makers understood that a framework really is needed of this very complex system to help us understand, and particularly help decision makers understand these interdependencies, but also the trade-offs between the three components and the synergies between water, energy, and food. So what are we trying to achieve? What are the aims of the Nexus? And the first three aims that I've listed here are broad aims that apply globally, nationally, even at local level, at catchment level. So we really need more coordinated management and efficient use of natural resources across sectors and across scales. And the Nexus is seen to provide a framework and an approach to do that. It's also seen as a way to achieve better progress on our National Development Plan and the Sustainable Development Goals. And my colleagues on the panel will speak to that in their presentations. And also it is seen to be able to enhance the integration of policy, planning, financing, and governance, which is not an easy thing to get right. If we look at the farm level, if we think that we can maybe apply the Nexus approach at farm level, then it does offer opportunities to enhance security and sustainability of resources, so particularly water and energy that are used as inputs to farming, to achieve greater efficiencies of resource use, to see how we can really make more use of our water and to expand irrigation for economic development as envisaged in our NDP, and then ultimately to enhance food security and on-farm and for enterprise risk mitigation or risk assessment and mitigation. Then for rural households, it's possible, and we need to see whether this is actually a useful approach, to possibly use the Nexus to find ways to alleviate the trade-offs that are made in households between access to water, energy, and food, so that essential human needs are met and it promotes well-being. And also to see how we can leverage opportunities for poverty alleviation and job creation and development using this approach. This is the basic diagram that captures what the essence of the Nexus. It was developed, as I said, in around 2015, but this particular version was developed by our local colleagues, in fact, the colleagues on the panel, as a proposed WEF Nexus framework for South Africa. It uses the conventional classic three pillars of water, energy, and food. It shows the interconnectedness of each of those, the bidirectional arrows. But then also importantly, it does have a central, the green bubble in the middle, where other externalities or other factors that are intricately also, part of this Nexus and the way it plays out, especially in the development context, also need to be considered. So for example, ecosystems, natural resources, livelihoods, and land. And I'm going to be speaking very much to livelihoods and also to some extent land in my presentation. When we look at this on a global level, the demand for these resources is escalating. The demand for fresh water globally expected to increase by about 40%, if not more. Demand for energy also very high, increasing probably by about 50% in the next few decades. And the demand for food as the population grows. So how are we going to get this right without increasing insecurity of each of these? This framework is embedded within a bigger framework, which I'm not going to unpack now. Some of my colleagues might speak to it, they developed it, but it shows that this is within a bigger system. We need to look at also the direct and indirect drivers that are impacting on the Nexus, policies and strategies and governance that then ultimately lead to the outcomes that we need. But I'm going to look in my presentation a little bit more at the innovations. So what are the practical things maybe at local level, at farm level, household level, where we can actually use the Nexus to make a difference? In the next few slides, I'm very quickly, very briefly, and quite high level, just going to unpack some of the interlinkages so people can wrap their minds around, what this actually means on the ground. So when we look at the interlinkages, we quite commonly say water for food, and then the other way around would be food for water. So water for food, I think, is the easiest one to envisage. It's all about irrigation at various scales, from smallholders all the way to large commercial irrigation systems. We also need water for our livestock production systems, and we need water very much in the value chain, in packaging, in processing, in the whole value chain. So this, I think, is the easy one to understand. Then if we look at water for energy, maybe this is not as well known, but there have been studies done around this for South Africa. Water is very much required for, if we look at the fossil fuels, extraction of coal, processing, and also the cooling of the towers in our system. that uses a fair amount of water. If we look at the renewable energy sources, the water footprint is much, much lower. We have hydropower, which does not consume water, but it generates water using the flow of water. And then the renewable energy options need a little bit of water for manufacturing, but in their whole lifetime, they have a very, very small water footprint. So we know that water is needed. It's not huge amounts of water, but it is essential that that water is available for continuity. Then if we look at energy for water, energy on the farm, as everyone knows, is essential to pump. Energy is used, or electricity, diesel pumps, more and more we're using solar panels, PV panels. Wind has always been used for pumping of surface water, and then of course groundwater. Pumping of aquifers is more and more becoming a very important source of water now. And then energy is used for the purification of water, wastewater, and some of that water goes back into the system and can be used for irrigation. So that is also an important one. Then if we look at energy for food, energy is used on farm, particularly in the use of diesel and petrol and also electricity. But then we mustn't forget that the value chain uses a lot of energy, especially for, well, some of it for packaging processing, but a lot of energy is needed for cooling, the cold chain, all the way through to the retailer. That cold chain must be maintained, and that if that energy is not reliable or not there, then those opportunities are not there either. Then food for energy is a tricky one. In South Africa, we have laws around how much biomass or how much crop production can be used for bioenergy, for biofuel, for example. But there are opportunities, and also the use of animal waste in producing biogas. So those are some of the linkages between energy and food. The next slide, I'm going to unpack a little bit what this all could mean at a farm level. And I'm going to start with, first of all, energy, water, and food. All three together are captured in irrigation, basically. And the opportunities here are, we know that optimizing energy efficiency, especially for pumping, at the same time, then also increases our water efficiency, and vice versa. If we increase our water efficiency, we use less energy. So there are many, many opportunities for us to improve efficiencies all around in the system. There are many opportunities now with the transition to the green economy and the transition in the energy system to more and more use renewable energy on farm. And some of those opportunities, for example, solar groundwater pumps, which are already used, but there's more opportunity for that. There's new technology available for solar micro desalination, for example, of water that has a high EC, salt content, or that needs to be purified, but can be used for in smaller volumes on farm. And then the use of wastewater, and energy is obviously needed to purify water that can then be used back in the system for irrigation. When we do development of renewables on the farm, we need to also remember that water is needed. For example, in biogas digesters, there is a component where we need to make sure that we have water of the right volume and quality. And then water for packaging and processing, as I mentioned, the opportunities there for optimizing efficiencies and reusing wastewater in that system as well. On the energy and food side, more and more the problem of climate change and the need to reduce our carbon footprint in agriculture has come to the fore. If we look at, for example, agrochemicals, there's already an embedded energy in fertilizers, for example. Already 50% of the embedded carbon comes from the production of the fertilizer rather than what happens in the fields. So, you know, trying to move to low carbon agriculture, we need to look at how we can do that. We can use more energy efficient equipment and make sure that we maintain our cold chains, our pack lines, so that those efficiencies are optimized. Solar, wind, and hydro energy can be harnessed to provide electricity that can substitute maybe for some of the dirtier fuels, if you want to call it that, and substituting liquid fuels as well for low carbon fuels that are becoming more and more available. And globally, I think there's going to be a big move towards electric when that is possible. And then, of course, using plants or waste and manure for energy. I've spoken about that already. And then I want to really also latch onto this idea of bringing land in, especially in South Africa. Many decisions are being made on land use, land that is needed for renewable energy installations, for solar farms, for wind farms, other decisions on land use changes that are made. For example, mining versus agriculture is a hot topic. If we look at clearing of invasive alien plants, this also speaks very much to the water system as well as energy, because that can be used for energy generation. And then certain farming systems like conservation agriculture that really speak to this whole system as well in terms of optimizing these components. I'm going to switch now to the household level and sustainable livelihoods. This is the classic sustainable livelihoods approach that was developed in the UK a long time ago and is used a lot for these kind of studies. And I'm going to focus on that middle block, the pentagon, which really is about the livelihood assets or the capitals, where we need financial, social, human, natural, and physical capital to secure and develop livelihoods. And I'm really just going to show in the following presentations how these 5 capitals can perhaps be linked to the WEF Nexus approach or the framework in order to understand what happens at household level. I'm going to draw on a particular study that was completed last year with many collaborators. It was funded by the Water Research Commission, and it looked at 3 catchments across the country, 3 highly stressed catchments, and 6 communities within those catchments, spanning peri-urban and rural communities. And without going into too much detail on this, this conceptual diagram, but if you look at the WEF nexus embedded there within the house, the W, E, and F circles within the house, and then the capitals, the human capital, social capital, speak about the household members, or it can even be a farming household, and the surrounding communities. Then we have physical capital, which is your basic services, especially access to and availability of those basic services, and speaking to infrastructure and governance there. And on the financial side, what is the income? What is the participation in the economy? And that speaks very much to affordability when it comes to the nexus. And then at the bottom, the natural capital, so ecosystem services, access to water, and so on, and land really becoming important there as well, availability and access. And so what are the main findings of the study? What do we know? There's not much research being done about nexus at this kind of very much on the ground level. And so this is the first study that gives us some indication of where the pressure points are. I'm going to start with households that indicate that they do food gardening or farming. And it's clear that households that have a high reliance or that are in these areas where they do gardening, yes, they rely very much on natural capital, so land, water, and wood as well as social capital. And they use these to their advantage to cope with financial and physical capital shortfalls. So where infrastructure and services and finances are insufficient. A reliable source of income from farming certainly provides greater energy and food security in those households. Home food gardening is patchy across those catchments, and where it happens, it's very much dependent on access to good quality land and to water. This was often said as a barrier to doing more home food gardening was inadequate bulk water supply to those communities. Then livelihood WEF insecurity was evident in households that depend on employment in more formal agriculture fisheries sector, and particularly people who said that they are seasonal or casual participants in the sector where they are away from home and housing and services are suboptimal. Then if we look at access, in summary, that access to water and energy, certainly most of these households now have access to a grid electricity and piped water, and that is a major developmental progress that has been made in this country. But we found that access and the connection is not enough. So it does not imply that people are using these connections because of the cost factor, or the reliability of supply is not there. So demand is often not met, even if they are connected. Adequate municipal service delivery definitely increases household WEF security, and we found this in municipalities where service delivery is good. Access to and affordability of electricity or gas, so for example, having a fridge or a stove, improves food storage, it improves healthy cooking practices and dietary diversity, and it also reduces food waste. So that is a very positive connection. The use of additional sources of energy and water is very low, and this was surprising. And this does affect energy and water security where supply is often interrupted or it's not affordable. And then almost all households do purchase their food either formally or informally within their system. Even households that grow their own food to a large extent also still purchase food. So the cost factor for food is extremely important in all households. The most important result that came from the study is the most important determinant of security of livelihood and WEF is the affordability of water, energy, and food in relation to total household income and other expenses. So the surveys show clearly that poorer households make these daily trade-offs between purchasing water, energy, and food In other words, they practice income substitution because there just isn't enough income to go around for all the basic needs. And so even when something happens like forced bottled water purchases, then reduce purchases of food and energy and lead to insecurity. Water is essential. We can't do without water. So in these households, the trade-offs and the substitutions usually relate to reduced energy and food purchases amounts and also food diversity. Increase in energy poverty can certainly compromise household food security. So where there's not enough energy, food selection choices become poor because cooking habits are very limited, and so nutritional insecurity can occur. And then what really comes out strongly across all the communities, household income where there is a pension or a SASSA grant provides a significant buffering against WEF insecurity. And this is because this income is not subject to instability in the local water, energy, and food supply systems. So if we conclude now, just a few closing thoughts. This is not a straightforward approach at the local level. My colleagues will speak more at the higher scales, where some of these things have been better studied and also implemented already, but certainly at this household and farm level, it's not so well studied and it's not simple. So certainly technocratic and sectoral solutions and approaches as we currently operate basically in the economy are necessary, but they are insufficient. Equally important is household demographic characteristics of the farming enterprise at local level, the local context. Income and financial resources, which vary widely. The land issue always comes up again, the local governance and service delivery, and then agencies. So bringing in the human and the social capital, because that is what people use to survive and to make ends meet. Access and stability of access, especially when it comes to water and energy services, and also affordability. Those are significant barriers. And those are where we actually need to look. Those are our so-called pressure points. The other thing that comes out is that land cannot be optimally developed to help drive local economic and social development without access to water. There is agriculture and development. There are many opportunities that do not require so much water, but certainly if agriculture and more intensive high value as a driver of local economic development, as it's envisaged in the NDP, if that is to happen, then land and water and energy, all these things have to be assessed together as a system. And then while national policies certainly have increasingly addressed the nexus, including it in a more integrated frameworks, many farmers and communities on the ground are not yet experiencing the intended benefits. My last slide then, certainly increased ability to assess the whole system is provided by the nexus approach. The strength of the nexus approach is that it focuses equally on all the three components. So no more silos, no more special interests, and that certainly is helpful when we're trying to optimize decision making. It can also help to strengthen risk assessment and investment decisions. It can provide resilience to climate change and carbon-related market pressures, for example, by showing us where we can reduce our footprint without forfeiting WEF security. The WEF can help us identify the weakest interlinkages and especially those pressure points. And then if we can make decisions and finance to alleviate those pressure points and unlock the potential that is still causing us to not to be able to get those economic and developmental benefits from those linkages. And then evidence for the acceleration of the energy transition to cost-effective renewables is strengthened by looking at it through the WEF lens. And also looking at it through the WEF lens really shows us how important it is to increase our water use efficiencies and to start accessing sustainable new sources, possibly using renewable energy technologies that are now becoming increasingly cost-effective. And overall, I think it is a strong approach to integrated infrastructure development and decision-making, even at the local level. And that's where I'd like to finish my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that, Professor Midgley. So we do have about 5 minutes or so if the audience has any questions specifically for Professor Midgley. While we wait for you to post any questions, I think one of the questions that I have from my side, Professor, is what you highlighted as one of the most important points, and that's the affordability aspect of these resources. And especially if we also consider that we want to look at sustainable use, Is the solution to the affordability problem, is it to make these resources cheaper, so to make electricity and water cheaper, or is it about enabling people to be able to afford it by creating jobs and ensuring that people have higher incomes so that they can afford it?
Yes, Janine, that's a tricky question, and my take on it is that I don't think that we can make food and water cheaper. I think the externalities also already speak to the fact that those two factors are already they're not affordable maybe necessarily, but they are, the externalities already are not being factored into the prices for those. I think the opportunities are in energy, where energy prices are very high or have increased very, very steeply in the last few years. And I think if we try to develop our energy sources that, going into the cost-effective renewable sources that over time will make energy more affordable and cheaper at local level, I think that is the way to go. So overall, I think, yes, there are opportunities on the energy side maybe to make it cheaper, but I think the solution lies on the other side. I think the solution is that people do need to find employment. They need to have a sustainable, secure income of a reasonable level so that they can afford to purchase the necessary, the basics for their family needs.
Okay. And then something else. So why do we have these three elements in the Nexus? Why is it water, energy, and food? Why does it not include, for example, environment or ecosystems, or I guess in the South African context, and from your presentation, you did make a lot of mention of land and access to land. So why are these other factors not included in this Nexus framework?
So I think the framework, there have been many, many different attempts to change the framework, to include other aspects like environment, to include land. In fact, there was an attempt, there was a South African framework developed, which included land much more strongly and the environment. But I think the one I showed is the one that is still, it's stuck. It was the original one, and I think people are trying to stick with one kind of framework, so not to confuse everybody. But the South African framework, the proposed one, does include land in the center. It might not be one of the three pillars, but it is an absolutely essential one to show in that central block that everything does still revolve around land, and also environment. In the developing context, there's a lot of reliance still on developing, we're using natural resources for economic development. And we have to consider those as well. So yes, it's possible to include those as part of two or three or two extra pillars if you want to, but one doesn't want to confuse everybody. But I think definitely land is a critical one to address.
Okay, and then from your research and from what you've presented, so what do you think are the current shortcomings in the water, energy, food nexus approach at farm level and then sort of at the local level?
I think what's come through in the research is how important it is that we improve on service delivery. That is not something that the individual household or farmer can necessarily deal with, but certainly the political process needs to deal with the fact that service delivery is a big barrier. I think infrastructure, maintenance, and development is also a really big barrier, both for the farming communities and for the rural communities. Infrastructure really is a central pillar for all of these things to work for people at ground level.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think we will come back to that discussion at the end when we've got our other panelists in the final Q&A session, because I think that that's a very important point to discuss further, the role that that service delivery has to play in really in implementing what the suggestions are around the Nexus. So I want to move. Thank you for that, Professor Mitchley, and we'll see you again in the panel session after the other two presentations. So I want to move on to our next presenter, and that is Professor Nashi Mabaodi, and he is from the Center of Transformative Agriculture and Food Systems at the University of KwaZulu-Natal's School of Agricultural, Earth and Environmental Science. Professor Mabaodi's primary goal is to work on research and development that is dynamic, transformative, and that informs policy and achieves real-life impacts within poor communities. Professor Mabaodi will be speaking about assessing the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals through Nexus Planning. Welcome, Professor Mabaodi, and thank you for joining us.
Welcome, Janine, and thank you for having us.
I see you've already shared your presentation, so you are welcome to jump straight in and take the floor from here.
Thank you very much. And a good thank you to my colleague, Stephanie. I think she has already laid a very good foundation for our presentations that are to come from here. So I'll pick up from where she left off, and hopefully I'll also address some of the questions that you had for her presentation. So what I'll do is I'll take you through briefly, the thinking behind Nexus and how we move to linking the Nexus with the SDGs and some of the analysis that we have done as part of our research in terms of modeling the relations in the WEF Nexus. So the Water-Energy-Food Nexus generally resides within the context of what we call Nexus thinking or Nexus planning. And within this context, there are various nexus that are there. And essentially, when we are talking about the nexus, we are referring to the integration or integrated management and governance across sectors, scales, and resources. So the Water-Energy-Food Nexus is one of many types of nexuses that exist. So it's all about simultaneous and polycentric integration and consideration of interlinkages, trade-offs, and synergies, which is what Stephanie was talking about, that holistic approach, as opposed to a monocentric, which is a sector-driven approach. So in the past, we've had a lot of integrated approaches, but they tended to be driven from particular sectors. So they were still monocentric in terms of how they were being driven. That is where the WEF or Nexus thinking basically distinguishes itself in that it is polycentric in nature. And we do have various types of nexuses. We've got what we are discussing today, the Water-Energy-Food Nexus. We've got the Urban Nexus. We've got the Water, Health, Environment Nexus. We've got Agriculture, Environment, Health Nexus, and many other types of nexus that are there. And there has been a lot of conversation around adding environment, to call it the welfare nexus, argument to add L at the end for land, or to add the C for climate. But I think that is just complicating issues further. In terms of the environment, it's embedded already within the broader thinking of the WEF Nexus, because ecosystems and environmental management underpin the WEF Nexus. So in terms of what we have done, on the WEF Nexus concept itself, the WEF Nexus is you look at it from three particular perspectives. The first of which is understanding it as a conceptual framework. That is the WEF Nexus concept. And that is when you want to understand the issue of synergies, trade-offs that exist among the three different sectors in this instance. Then you also want to understand the WEF Nexus from a discourse perspective, which is where it can be used to facilitate discourse and discussion, or to guide discourse and discussion, which is the context in which we are conversing today. This is discourse, where we are using the WEF Nexus framing and thinking to facilitate discourse. And then it can also be considered as an analytical tool, where you're actually now moving into the realm of quantifying the linkages that exist between the sectors. And I think it is in the quantification where now a lot of progress and focus is being driven towards. So this is just a conceptual framework of Nexus processes and the SDGs and how we link them. And particularly in terms of water, energy, and food, we linked them to SDGs 2, 6, and 7. In this framework, we have included environment and human health. So this is just an extension of the framework that we developed in 2018, which Stephanie just shared with you earlier on. So this is just an extension of that. And here we're now looking more around how do we actually move from Nexus thinking to Nexus doing and start informing policy and practice, especially regarding the SDGs. And the SDGs are particularly important because almost all countries are tracking progress towards the SDGs. And for countries such as South Africa, our National Development Plan essentially speaks to the SDGs, and a lot of targets that are in the National Development Plan are also aligned with the SDGs. So tracking the SDGs is also useful for understanding progress in terms of socioeconomic development at a national or regional level. So what we have done in terms of analyzing the water, energy, food nexus and the trade-offs is we have focused on the securities part, because one of the priorities in Southern Africa and South Africa for adopting the water, energy, food nexus approach is the achievement of simultaneous water, energy, and food securities. So we then took the definition of securities, we came up with pillars that relate to availability and access, and then we identified indicators in the SDGs that we could link to the indicators and the targets related to availability and access. And then we, in cognition of the conversations around broadening the nexus, we also then added in the WEN nexus, which is water, health, environment, and nutrition. And we added several other indicators related to SDGs 3, 15, and 2 to focus on those aspects. So this was a case where we're broadening the WEF nexus to look at other dimensions of interest. And this is just a list of the indicators that we have developed for assessing the water, energy, food, and the water, health, environment, nutrition nexus. And as you can see, they are mostly linked to issues of access and availability. And the important thing is that these indicators are interchangeable. So in this case, we were doing a country level assessment for South Africa. So we looked at indicators that spoke more to the national picture, but these indicators are interchangeable depending on scale, whether they're looking at it from a catchment perspective, a provincial or a local municipality perspective, depending on the different priorities that would also be featuring within that context. So here we've got things such as proportion of crops and so forth. In other areas, it might differ because it might not be crops, it might be another activity. It might not be forest area, it might be another land use activity that dominates. So it's important to understand that the indicators themselves are interchangeable depending on the scale of analysis and the objective for the analysis. So what we did is we developed, after we developed these indicators, we used a methodology called multi-criteria decision analysis and pairwise matrix comparison to come up with composite indices for those indicators in the WEF. And these are the composite indices that we came up with. So these composite indices can then be visualized through these spider diagrams. I think Stephanie also shared one. The interesting thing that came across from our assessment was that there is an imbalance in terms when you look at the three sectors. And a lot of that imbalance comes from a greater focus on food self-sufficiency. So South Africa, I think, driven from the perspective of poverty alleviation and unemployment creation, with agriculture being identified as a major sector for job creation, and food security also being a national priority. So the priorities in the food security considerations tend to outweigh the priorities or the prioritization of water and energy considerations, which then creates an imbalance in the system, which is what we've got. So what we want to apply in terms of the WEF. So when Steph was talking, she was saying the WEF is useful for being able to visualize and identify where the imbalances exist in the system. And it is also useful for identifying the intervention areas, which are our nexus points or leverage points, where we need to intervene to bring about greater balance and sustainability within the system. And this basically just shows us the changes between our assessment when we looked at 2015 and 2020. And I think you can still see that the focus on food self-sufficiency is still there. There's a huge focus on that. And you can also see the increasing focus on energy productivity, which is also creating problems. And there's been research that has shown that in areas such as Mpumalanga, the focus on energy production and then the expansion of coal mining to support that energy agenda is creating conflict with water pollution in the VAL, as well as food security, as it is now competing for food production land with other crops that were being produced in the area. Because the areas that are being zoned for mining are also overlapping with some of South Africa's most arable lands. So we can see there's an emerging focus on energy productivity and an increasing and sustained focus on food self-sufficiency. And those continue to create an imbalance in the system, which then challenges our overall progress towards achieving some of the SDGs. In terms of the way forward, what the analysis shows is basically that we still have a very strong sector-based approach, and we need to move towards more integrated resource management and planning. However, we lack platforms for effective coordination and collaboration across the sectors to inform and encourage meaningful planning and implementation across the sectors. So whilst we may have documents that speak to integrated planning, we do not actually have the platforms to enable, or to create an enabling environment for the implementation of what is written in those documents. And as I have mentioned, we are looking at different nexuses in this conversation today. We are focusing on the Water-Energy-Food Nexus, but it is important to realize that there are other nexuses that are there, which are equally as important and also need to be considered in order to have a more holistic understanding and approach to tracking development or progress towards the SDGs. Nexus planning in general offers potential for us to be able to track this progress. And we are currently at the stages of automating our modeling approaches so that we can be able to model and produce, yearly updates using available data in terms of progress towards the SDGs, as well as to be able to simulate in terms of if we continue with the same policies, where do we end up in 2030? And if decisions are to be made differently, how would that impact the WEF Nexus? Apologies for that. Some of the limitations that we have are related to data scarcity at different spatial scales. So that becomes a limitation. Remember when I spoke earlier about applying the Nexus approach at different scales, So you find that as you move or as you increase granularity, data access can become a limitation to you being able to apply some of these models. And then there is a need to upscale the use and planning of Nexus tools as decision support tools, and to support their implementation in terms of informing decision-making and evaluation at the same time. And there's also a need to start mainstreaming what we have achieved so far into policy and decision-making. So in conclusion, these are just some of the papers that we have published where this presentation emanated from. And what I was speaking to today forms part of a study where we were actually assessing progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And the model that we have been applying was developed and is also publicly available in terms of the modeling procedures and steps. We are currently developing the tool to be able to disseminate the model more publicly. Thank you very much. That brings me to the end of my presentation. And those are some of the key questions that I have for our audience today.
Thank you for that presentation, Professor Mabaodi. And so again, if you do have any questions specifically for Professor Mabaodi based on the presentation, you're all welcome to post them in the chat or Q&A function. Some questions from me, Professor Mabaodi. I think I want to start with one of these questions that you posed to the audience and see if you might have any insights. And I think it's really important and probably at the essence of what we are trying to get to today with this webinar, and that is to really understand how this type of thinking and how this type of planning around the Nexus can help South Africa to really achieve greater water, energy, and food security.
Can you come again?
Yeah, sure. So I was saying that I want to start with one of these questions that you have posed to us to see if you've got any insights to share with us. And that is around how this type of thinking and how the Nexus approach can really help South Africa to achieve better water, energy, and food security.
Okay, I think the most important thing is, first, the Nexus approach or Nexus planning helps us to understand the complexities and to be able to then understand where the synergies are and where the trade-offs exist. A lot of the imbalance that exists is because of planning that was unaware of the trade-offs, where decisions were taken simply because people considered the benefits and had not considered some of the trade-offs. And then along the line or during the course of implementation, then the trade-offs, emerge and they come back to bite you literally. So a WEF Nexus approach essentially allows for you to have that sort of understanding during the planning stage, which means you can mitigate some of those trade-offs and you can identify potential synergies that you can then leverage and maximize so that you create maximal beneficiation. So it is very useful in terms of guiding our investment planning. We've been talking a lot in South Africa about needing to invest in infrastructure development and wanting to use that infrastructure development as a catalyst for economic development and job creation. So if we consider the WEF Nexus and use it as an analytical tool and also as a framing tool for identifying and prioritizing those investments, it means we can come up with investments that are not only sustainable, but also give us the maximum beneficiation in terms of job and wealth creation.
So I think following on that, it's clear that we do need a lot more information just as a starting point on which to base decision making and possibly also our legislative process. So this is something that you mentioned in your presentation, and that is this problem of data scarcity, really at the different different spatial scales, which is a major limitation to the success of Nexus planning. So from a practical point of view, what can be done to address this problem of data scarcity?
Okay, the problem of data scarcity is two-pronged. There is the scarcity that is, basically indicative of there not being available data. That also reflects our monitoring and observation capabilities. So in that sense, we need to increase our monitoring and observation capabilities, or to integrate tools such as GIS and remote sensing that can allow us to incorporate or to obtain data for remote areas where we do not have observation networks. On this other part, the scarcity is man-made due to there not being, protocols or processes for data sharing, and also people not being aware that certain institutions collect certain data because they don't, tell anyone that they're sitting on such data sets. So if we have more open data sharing, across the different data generators in South Africa, we could address a lot of data scarcity just through that, and then complement the remote areas through using, GIS and remote sensing applications.
Thanks. We've got one guest who has joined us from the Philippines, and I think you'll be able to maybe answer this question. And it is about what is the best practices of sort of planning and implementation around the Water-Energy-Food Nexus in South Africa that can be adopted in other countries, or what has South Africa so far done right that can be a lesson for other countries in adopting this type of approach and thinking?
So in South Africa, we're still in the process of adopting this type of thinking. And we started, it's been a long journey that started around 2012 or so. But what we've managed to do so far is to get to a stage where we now understand the benefits of the approach. So we've adopted the approach, and we are now saying to ourselves, how do we move from theory to practice? So we're currently at a stage now where we are doing assessments to identify possible investments or WEF Nexus or WEF Smart investments that can then be focused on and to prioritize those investments. So that's where we are as South Africa in terms of the WEF in moving from theory to practice. So I think what we can share with other people is the approach in terms of how we have developed the conceptualization, contextualized it. You saw that framework that Stephanie shared. That was us contextualizing it to say, for South Africa, what does it mean? Because you need to contextualize some of these globally driven approaches to your own context and your own priorities. And then from there, now move into the stage of saying, now, how do we then take this into planning, and what sort of planning and implementation do we want to do? So that's the knowledge and best practice that we have to share at this stage.
Thank you for that. So we've got one more question that I want to pose to you before we move on to our next and final presentation. And this is from Freddie Rabutata, and he's from the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. Sort of a comment and a question asking if it would be better to start with case studies where we apply this framework at a municipal scale before it's rolled out at the provincial and national level.
Okay, so theoretically, we have done analysis at the different scales, and we are now at the stage where we are doing pilots at the different scales. We want to do pilots at all scales because the interventions differ. So you find at a local municipality level, it's more around the service delivery, which is the access and availability. When you move to different scales, let's say the catchment scales, it's more of the natural resource management at that scale that you need to manage. When you move to a national scale, again, it becomes more of an economic development imperative. And then when you move beyond the national into transboundary scales, it becomes an integration, imperative that is driving it. So you want to be able to do pilots at these different scales so that you also understand where does the case for investment make the most sense if we are to target our resources. So that's what we are currently trying to inform at this stage.
Okay, sorry, I do have one more question before we move on, and this is from Henny Kutsia, and I think this follows on from what you shared with us in response to that question from the audience member from the Philippines, and that is is there examples from other countries in terms of base planning, nexus practices that South Africa has based some of its thinking on?
I think in terms of the WEF Nexus, South Africa is actually a global leader in terms of the knowledge generation, because we pretty much started the WEF Nexus research at the same time as everyone else. And we have not only kept abreast with the global knowledge development, but we've sort of like been also, setting the pace in terms of that knowledge development. So I would say right now, we are developing the best practice locally that we hope to be able to influence and share with other countries in the global south in particular.
Thanks, and thanks again for your presentation. We will see you again after this third and final presentation when we go into the panel discussion.
Thank you.
All right, as I said, we are moving on to the last presentation from today. And unfortunately, Professor Sylvester Mpandeli, who's the Executive Manager for Water Utilization in Agriculture at the Water Research Council, is not able to join us this morning due to other commitments, but we are happy to welcome in his place Dr. Luxem Nahamu, who is the Research Manager for Water Use in Agriculture, also at the Water Research Commission, and he will deliver the Commission's presentation this morning. Dr. Nahamu's presentation will focus on the topic, the Water-Energy-Food Nexus as a strategy for water, energy, and food security in South Africa. We are very much looking forward to the information that you will be sharing with us this morning, Doctor. And yes, the floor is yours. Please take us through your presentation.
Thank you very much, Janine, for this opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine, and I see your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Agri-SA, for coming up with this good webinar. And we are excited as a Water Research Commission to showcase some of the research that we are doing for South Africa, the region, that is SADC, and global level. As you can see, the previous presenters, Stefan and Tafadzwa, the work they are presenting, we are happy to say that it is being funded by the Water Research Commission, and our products that we have developed on the Water-Energy-Food Nexus, we are known throughout the world now. We've published over 25 journal papers, and as I speak right now, Sylvester Mpandeli, who is the executive manager of my key strategic area, is right now with the Swedish embassy. He has been invited as well to speak on the Water-Energy-Food Nexus, and the minister also invited him, and we'll be talking about the Water-Energy-Food Nexus. So I just want to proceed with my work. You are going to see that I'm just going to consolidate exactly what my colleagues have said, but I'm going to say it in a very sweet way, and my slides are not moving. Are they moving? I don't know what's happening
No,
now.
they are not moving at the moment.
I don't know. It seems my laptop is frozen from my side. I'm clicking every button here, escape, move forward. It seems nothing is moving. My apologies for that. It's technology. Oh, something is moved now. Can you see my second slide?
Yes, so I can see the contents
Okay.
slide.
Okay, no, that's fine. No, my talk is mainly going to focus on the key national challenges. I'm going to focus on South Africa and what is driving this concept so predominantly in the country. Why the wealth nexus in South Africa? And what are the pathways towards resource security? And what are the advantages? Why moving from linearity to secularity? And I will just give some concluding remarks. But the talk is mainly on the, as you can see, the figure on your right there is about water, energy, food security, the security, like what my colleagues have just spoken about. Right, looking into South Africa, right, that diagram on your left, I'm going to start with that box, which is light green, bluish, where we are saying, in the case of South Africa, for example, 98% of the country's water resources are already allocated. Yet there's need, the population is growing, and now we are around 60 million people in South Africa, and the middle class is growing, which is resulting in the demand, in increased demand of resources. Yet more than 50% of the population or households is food insecure. Some say it's about economics, the shops are full of food. Whatever the case it is, it's about poverty and inequality in our country. You see, it's already causing some challenges. There's food in the market, yes, but over 50% of our population is food insecure. And yet we are still using 86% of the country's energy comes from coal. We know the challenges coal is facing. We need to reduce this percentage. And this is causing climate change. This is the main cause of climate change. And because of the population which is growing by urbanization, we've been disturbing the environment, we've been clearing land in order to have more cultivated lands. And this has affected natural habitats. That's why we see animals now invading cities. I was reading only last month or so about a baboon in Jamestown, which was just moving up and down willy-nilly. And in Europe, there are hogs. Shakira in Barcelona was attacked by hogs walking in the park. That is a wild pig. So even this pandemic, it's because of the interactions now between human beings and animals. And there's a threat of infectious diseases. And all these are being compounded by the challenges we are facing as a country. A lot of corruption, we are reading about corruption, so and so, poor public services. People are saying we are not going to vote because it's not making sense. Poor education, schools being vandalized, a host of challenges. And climate change is compounding all these challenges. So what is the way forward? The challenges that we are facing require transformative and integrated solutions to achieve sustainability from now going into the future. Right. This diagram which you are seeing now, it's almost similar to what Professor Mabaodi presented, but they are completely different. We should understand the background, where we are coming from in order to understand these, the challenges, the current challenges. In order to understand the Nexus planning, I prefer to call it Nexus planning because Prof. Mabaodi has already emphasized on that, because WEF Nexus is limited to water and energy, but there are a host of other nexuses out there. So there are 4 main thematic areas that we should understand here. The drivers of change. What is driving this change? And what is the risk and exposure level? And we need nexus thinking, nexus approaches or transformative approaches, the circularity, and as well as sustainable food system. I'm going to talk, it's not only about food, but here, because it's agri-SA, I said, let me focus more on sustainable food systems, which is well related to the circular economy. Let me go back to the drivers, to the first thematic areas. We have got socio-economic changes that are taking place because of the development that are taking place. I'm not going to go one by one. And also environmental changes. And they are also within these drivers, they are external drivers, which are causing exposure and sensitivity. We are saying, let's not focus linearity. The period of focusing on linear models has come to an end. Let's take a cue from the COVID-19 pandemic. When it came, the reactions were just reactive. Decision makers thought that by a click of a button, focusing on health issues, everything will come back to normal. Yet it caused a lot of challenges. Now unemployment in South Africa stands at more than 34%. And the prices are going up in the market. A lot of other challenges. Therefore, we are saying, let's not focus. This is silo thinking. Let's not focus on one thing. Let's move from linearity towards secularity. Now, that's why we are saying we need nexus planning, which is one of the transformative approaches, where we focus on environmental warfare and social welfare. I'm not going to focus on the vulnerability and all those things, but we are saying let's look into all these together simultaneously, holistically, in an integrated manner, in order to achieve sustainable food systems, simply meaning that we need to keep resources for a longer period in circulation in order to achieve those indicators Professor Mabaodi was talking about: food availability, food utilization, and food access. We should aim to keep those resources for a longer time in use. But where is this all coming from? Professor Mabaodi and Stephanie spoke about this briefly as well. But where are we coming from? You know, before the SDGs, there were MDGs, Millennium Development Goals. And when they were formulating these SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, there was already a challenge, and the models were already indicating the huge degradation and depletion of essential resources, which are water, energy, and food. And decision makers at international level saw that we have to change the way we do things. That is why we hear the word change from norm. We have to change from the way we do things and move forward. Therefore, Nexus Planning is an alternative towards sustainability by 2030. That's why the circle there is not ending. It's a circle that is just continuing. We need circularity. It started in 2011, actually, at the World Food Economic Forum. Before that period, it was more sector-centric. There were more sector-centric approaches like the integrated water resources management. I know I'm rattling some feathers there. People want to stick with their models. But you are saying it is no longer working. The challenges that we are facing no longer work. But since 2011, we could see a change. There's a lot of prominence in circular models, transformative approaches, WEF Nexus, a lot. Almost every day I receive emails from Google Scholar saying almost 10 emails of new publications on the Water-Energy-Food Nexus. Why? Because it is cross-sectorial in approach. It informs transformational change. and it is secular in form. Now, going back to South Africa, I want to focus on the agriculture area. What are the options to enhance food efficiency? We are facing a host of challenges, as I have already alluded to. And what are the opportunities or options to enhance food use efficiency, resource use efficiency? Increase the land under irrigation? Yes, you can do that. Without empirical evidence, you can do that. But the question still remains the same. Do we have the land, energy, and water resources to do that? The National Development Plan says plans or intends to increase the land under irrigation by, I'm not sure if this is the right figure, but around 45,000 hectares by 2030. But do we have the resources to do that? Where's the water? Where's the water? We are saying 98% of the water resources are already allocated, leaving little room for development. We can also improve resource use efficiency by improving on agronomic practices. Prof. Midgley and Prof. Mabaodi have already spoken on that. Then alternative water sources. Groundwater, can we use groundwater? Yes, we can still use groundwater. It is widely used in irrigation at the moment, and some cities entirely depend on groundwater in South Africa. But the question still remains the same. Is it sustainable given the declining rainfall we've been experiencing, drought in the country? Is it sustainable groundwater? If we're able to quantify it, we don't know how much groundwater we have. Then energy requirements for pumping groundwater, do we have the energy? Prof. Mabaodi also spoke on solar irrigation. I'm not going to draw much on that. Therefore, what are the management solutions? Integrated water resources management or water-energy-food nexus, transformative approaches, monocentricism, or polycentricism. This is not the first time we're hearing these terms. Linearity or secularity. Okay, here I'm just trying to compare linear and monocentric approaches versus secular and polycentric approaches. With linear models, they are sector-based resource planning and management. Divergent sector-based policies. They aggravate contemporary crises. They provide optimal sub-efficiency in one sector because we are focusing on one sector. Therefore, they provide false achievements, development, yet those challenges have been transferred to other sectors. Like what is happening right now, a lot of unemployment and a lot of other issues. Then with the secular models and polycentric approaches, they are cross-sectorial resource planning and management, and they interact with the present, but also in mirroring into the future. They expedite the resilience of building initiatives, create a balanced system through use of smart technologies. Let me not talk about this spider graph, but you can see that through modeling, cross-sectorial modeling, we can see the areas that need to be improved. Therefore, modeling informs policymakers on areas needing immediate or urgent interventions. Right, my concluding remarks here, we need to tap into renewable sources of energy, that is solar energy, for example, to abstract groundwater resources for irrigation, and then to targets to increase area under irrigation should be balanced with available water and energy resources, then investing in small-scale irrigation schemes to develop resilient food systems and strengthening small-scale farmers' capacity to adapt to climate variability and change. There is a need for human capacity development to ensure that small-scale farmers are equipped to take advantage of the investments. Then adopting a water-energy-food nexus approach will allow for balanced and sustainable increases in agriculture productivity. Then some points to ponder. some take-home messages the issues that we need to think about when we finish this webinar. Is it feasible to increase the area under irrigation in South Africa to enhance food, water, and energy security under the prevailing challenges? Is it feasible? What are the opportunities to operationalize the Water-Energy-Food Nexus in South Africa? Is it possible? Are there any opportunities to operationalize the Water-Energy-Food Nexus? Those are my points. And with that, I say thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Nahamu. And again, so there's an opportunity now to ask any questions specifically related to this last presentation before we go into the more general panel discussion. A question maybe for clarity that I've got based on the presentation, Dr. Nahamu, is you did mention in your presentation that 98% of South Africa's available water resources have already been allocated. So does that mean that 98% of all water in South Africa is already allocated, or does the opportunity still exist to grow this resource base, for example, by creating more infrastructure? And if it can be grown, I mean, to what extent? How much more water can be made available?
Yes, Denine, thank you for such a good question. That is very valid. Yes, currently, statistics show that 98% of our water resources are already allocated. And we know that South Africa is the 30th driest country in the world. We are facing serious water scarcity challenges in the country. And as I have already mentioned, and there's little room to maneuver. If we need to take action, it's now. We don't have to wait until it gets worse. I'm sitting in Tshwane, some of our suburbs don't have water as we speak. And the dam water levels have gone down badly. Thank God it rained a lot this evening here. But yes, we cannot rule out signs. I was speaking of secular approaches. We need to keep some of our resources for a long period in circulation. We need to reduce waste and even to convert wastewater into a useful product. For your own information and for our participants here present, currently on the Water Research Commission website, we have, from my strategic area, there are 5 proposals that are there, over 20 million rands. If you are interested to go there related to Water-Energy-Food Nexus, go there and check those. If you're interested, please write a proposal and submit to us. Yes, Danini, we are saying the opportunities are there to increase the agricultural land, irrigated area. The opportunities are there, but it must be informed by science. And also to make sure that there is, to enhance crop water productivity, to make sure that there are more crops that come out from a single drop of water. We need to do that. There's a lot of wastage at the same time as we speak. Thank you.
So I just want some clarity on that. So are you saying that there is the opportunity to grow this resource base, even though it is constrained, that it can still be developed to an extent?
Yes, I still believe with the science, the room, we have to. Whether if the population is growing, we have to. So the opportunities are there. We can still utilize those two and actually reduce the amount of water that is allocated to agriculture. We can reduce it and also allocate it to other sectors that need water.
So we haven't spoken much about the impact that climate change will have on all of this. I think we can get into that more during the panel discussion, but maybe just to get us started, if you can comment on whether or not South Africa's current climate change response strategy Has it been developed with the challenges represented by the Water-Energy-Food Nexus in mind?
Yes, Janini, yeah, the good thing, South Africa is well ahead than other countries in the region, in Southern Africa, and probably in the world. The region is known for Water-Energy-Food Nexus. We've done quite a lot. And for your information, the climate strategy speaks on integration, working together, seeing things together. You know, when it was developed, the concept of the Water-Energy-Food Nexus might not have developed, but you could see ways like working together, simultaneous, holistic approaches, transformation. If you see this, that's why we are not using the word WEF Nexus as per se. We are saying it's Nexus planning. It's about integration. So yes, the climate change strategy speaks on the Water-Energy-Food Nexus.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I'm going to invite all the other presenters to also join us as we go into the panel discussions. So the audience members are welcome to pose questions to any of the panel members now, or even to, if you want more than one of the members to weigh in. Just to get us started, I want to return to a question that we've already spoken of a bit, and this is about the implementation of what we are planning now. So a large number of municipalities in South Africa are being poorly managed, and some of them to the point where they are sort of facing institutional collapse, and there's a serious problem with service delivery in many municipalities. Yet many of the interventions contained in this Nexus approach will have to be implemented at municipal level. So, and I would like all the panel members to weigh in on this, on, you know, what can be done to ensure that municipalities are in fact in a position to implement the necessary changes, so that we move from the discussion phase to the implementation phase when it comes to these issues. I'll start with you, Professor Mabaodi.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's a very challenging question, but I'll try to respond to it from a technical perspective. One of the biggest gaps that we have within our municipalities is an infrastructure problem. There is aging infrastructure that is under pressure. So those drivers that Stephanie was speaking to, growing urban populations, we've got people migrating into these urban areas, and it's overwhelming the design of the systems in terms of the service delivery. So there needs to be innovation around, you know, the infrastructure development to be able to deliver to all the citizens within the municipal boundaries. So there's need for investment in integrated innovation, which is where the WEF Nexus can come into play, because some of the approaches, such as the circular economy approach, would be useful in addressing issues of water and sanitation in peri-urban areas where you need off-grid sanitation solutions. And then if you do a waste to energy in those systems, you can then also address energy situations in those areas and address the issue of people who are of illegal connections. You can also do a waste to agriculture and address the issues of food security within those areas. So you can actually, you know, implement the Nexus thinking within a green village setup to address some of the constraints within the peri-urban and informal settlements. You can also take the WEF Nexus approach to look at a revision of spatial planning laws, because some of the problems that we have are historical in terms of the spatial planning laws that are there, which need to be reconfigured. And again, WEF Nexus planning and framing can help you in terms of how to design, you know, sustainable and resilient cities of the future. That's two. there's the need to build capacity within the municipalities themselves, because another gap is you could have the integrated infrastructure, you could have the innovations around them, but if you don't have the necessary capacity within the municipality to then be able to champion the service delivery, that becomes a key gap. So we need to upskill our municipal officials. And then, of course, the biggest thing that people have to also take into consideration is that whilst the WEF Nexus is discussed and conceptualized within a technical setting, it is actually a social issue, because the end goal is improving livelihoods, human and environmental well-being. So there's a big social element which requires engagement and social actors and citizen participation into the process. Thank you.
I'm going to come to you, Professor Mitchley, if you want to weigh in on this matter on, what do we do about this, this problem of service delivery, especially at municipal level, and, how this relates to the Water-Energy-Food Nexus approach?
Denine, I'd like to pick up on one of the points that Professor Mabaodi mentioned and just expand a little bit on it. I think it's a low-hanging fruit, because if we look at human resources within municipalities, and I'm speaking both about the political offices as well as the more technical engineering offices in municipalities, I think especially on the technical side, we know that many of these positions are not filled. And so there's undercapacity, and I think that the engineers are sometimes just overwhelmed by the challenges and the lack of funding. And so I think one way to help would be this capacity building and changing the way we train our engineers. I believe firmly that we need to start bringing this holistic nexus thinking into the way we are training the people that are going to be doing the work on the ground, so that they are not only seeing the formulae and the engineering way of finding solutions, but that they are understanding what the implications are for food, for water, for energy, for communities, for social dynamics in a much broader way. And I think at the moment they are just not receiving that kind of training or skills development. And I think that would be a first step.
Okay. And Dr. Nahamu, some comments from you?
Yes, Denine, I think this is a very valid point. The issue of capacity development, capacity building at the local municipality level is very essential. But also, we need to adopt some of the recent technologies being successful in other countries. The issue of hydroponics and urban agriculture. Only a few weeks ago, I was reading about, was it Singapore or Malaysia? They've converted their buildings into agricultural fields. Just imagine a building like the Reserve Bank full of grapes. It's all covered by grapes. It's quite interesting. All the tall buildings, they are converting all our tall buildings into agricultural fields. I think it's one of the ways we can enhance service delivery at the municipal level. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps we can convert the South African Revenue Services building into a cannabis field for starters. So thanks for that. I want to get to one of the questions from the audience, Lisa Plitt, and she asked, in terms of what has been said about the Water-Energy-Food Nexus, how can South Africa be considering fracking in the Karoo? And she says that surely this undermines already fragile water and food supply and only increases our greenhouse gas contribution. I wonder, Janse, if this is maybe something that you want to weigh in on. I know that through Agri-SA, you have been doing quite a lot of work in terms of opposing those applications for shale gas exploration in the Karoo.
Janine, yes, and thank you for the question from Lisa. I simply don't believe that South Africa can afford a shale gas exploration and production industry. Not in the area where it's planned for, which is the Central Karoo, and not given the scarcity of particularly our water resources. And Our whole system of environmental governance places the precautionary principle right in the center of it. Also, obviously, looks at the need for putting humans and their needs at the center of all decision-making on this. But given global trends, given South Africa's very stressed water resources, I think shale gas, even to explore at this stage, is simply not viable. It's something that we should be certainly getting a change of heart from in our government. We see all these enormous developments and potential economic opportunities from renewable energy. And this is a global trend. You know, we can't get away from that now. We certainly can't get away from it if you look at what is going to be happening at COP26 and recent commitments on our nationally determined contribution for the negotiations that will take place in Glasgow later this year. In that context, shale gas is a no.
Okay. And I want to pose this to you as well, Professor Midgley, and to, I think, and sort of in the same vein as looking at fracking in the Karoo, also considering the fact that South Africa is still investing to a large extent in coal power instead of looking at more renewable options. So how are we to understand, on the one hand, what we see is actually happening versus what is being said?
Yes, I think this is a fraught area. We know that there is huge pressure now globally to downscale and eventually completely scale or phase out of coal. We are seeing this happening at a pace that I think nobody expected in the last year or two or three. The disinvestment and the big funders of new coal capacity that are pulling out, and just understanding that the science is telling us that we have very little fossil fuel left available that we can exploit if we want to keep our global warming to an acceptable or manageable level. So the science, the data are showing that we have to move out of coal quickly. Having said that, South Africa does have massive reserves and is still seeking to exploit some of that for some time, but I think we need to be quite ambitious. And Janse mentioned the nationally determined contribution that's been already submitted now for the COP, which shows much greater ambition to reduce our carbon emissions. And so there is going to have to be a much more rapid transition to also more affordable forms now, that mainly the renewable energies, where the technologies are available and there are huge opportunities in this country.
Thanks for that. So we've got a very important question here from Willem Symington, and I'm going to put this first to you, Dr. Nahamu, and he asks, where does water quality fit into the Nexus? And given then how we see that fitting into this framework, how do we manage pollution in these strategies?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Danine, and our participant. Very important. When I was giving the presentation, I spoke about wastewater. Well, at the moment, wastewater should be thrown away, but we are saying through Nexus Planning and the interventions that need to be done, we need to reuse that water, that triple R or quadruple R, to make sure that water, it may be polluted, but let's find ways of using it now and again, not to throw it away. But however, at the same time, we are talking of pollution. Professor Mabaodi spoke about the Mpumalanga situation. It's a big challenge, and most of our pollutants, atmospheric pollution, is coming from Mpumalanga, and some of the hazardous toxins in the air are coming from Mpumalanga, and it's also affecting the mining there, including the erosion, the water resources from acid mine drainage. The water quality is very bad, and at the Water Research Commission, we are currently funding some projects that are focusing on how to use polluted water as an irrigation source of water. Thank you.
Also got some questions here for Professor Mabaodi, and that's from Susanne Marais. So she says you mentioned that there are currently Nexus pilot case studies running on municipal, provincial, and national level. Could you maybe just go into which municipalities and provinces are partaking, and if we want to find out more about this, where can we find that information?
Okay, thank you. So I'll answer the question, and then I'll also weigh into the question that you posed to Dr. Namo.
Sure.
So in terms of the pilots, the Water Research Commission of South Africa is funding several projects, some through the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where I'm at, and others that are being led by the Agricultural Research Council and the International Water Management Institute, as well as Stellenbosch University. So there is a City of Cape Town with Nexus pilot study that is being led from Stellenbosch University. They can contact me and I can give them the contacts for the researchers at Stellenbosch University who are leading that. At the University of KwaZulu-Natal, we are working within the Umgeni catchment. So we are doing a catchment assessment at the Umgeni level. And then we are also doing a farm level assessment where we are looking at solar irrigation and how to integrate it. And that is all happening within the Umgeni catchment. And then there is another pilot that is happening in the Limpopo Basin, in the Upper Sands catchment, that is also being led partly by IMI as well as UNESCO IHE Delft. So I'm very welcome to sharing those, referrals with them. So we've got different pilots being led by different groupings, but the Water Research Commission is funding a significant chunk of those pilots. And then with regards to the issue of water quality, I mentioned earlier on that when we look at the modeling, the definition of water quality itself, of water security rather, actually specifies that we're not just talking about access and availability of water, but of water of a suitable quality for the intended use. So even in the modeling that we do, one of the indicators specifically relates to the issue of water quality. So water quality is an integral part of the water dimension of the Water-Energy-Food Nexus. It's an integral aspect of the underpinning of the WEF Nexus, which is on the ecosystems. Because one of the things that we are aiming to manage there, it's not just environmental flows in terms of the quantities of water that are being channeled back into the hydrological system, but also the quality of the water that is being put back into the system, because it all has implications. If we have water of poor quality, it has implications on the energy requirements to purify and treat that water for consumption. So part of the whole WEF Nexus framing, where I was talking about mitigating trade-offs, is being able to understand that if you go and implement certain practice in a particular area, the risk of polluting ground and surface water resources increases. And that is a downstream effect of also increasing the cost of treating and purifying that water for distribution. It also creates another issue in terms of what then happens to that waste when the water is treated. So the whole WEF Nexus framing tries to understand and mitigate those sort of issues.
Okay, thank you for that very valuable addition. So I'm going to move on. I've got a couple more questions that I've prepared that I'd like to discuss. And one of them is, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic, and then especially the way in which it has disrupted value chains locally and internationally, has changed the way in which we have to think about how we tackle those challenges around how we improve access to water, energy, and food, and I think especially access to food. I want to start with you, Professor Midgley, if you've got some comments on that.
Yes, I think it's been an incredibly interesting time. What I've taken out of the pandemic, and just in connection with the Web Nexus, is how our global interconnectedness is both a huge threat now. It is basically what's caused the pandemic to spread across the world so quickly, so intensively, but also that our connectedness has helped us to deal with it. And the benefits of being connected, having the technology available to protect ourselves and still keep our economies to some extent, or to a large extent, going. And the whole idea of being in this together and having to work together across sectors. This is not just a health sector issue. It affects every single person and every single other sector, and how we need to plan in a connected way. And that has really thrown that into the limelight, I think, and is helping us to maybe help to frame or explain what the Web Nexus thinking is all about. This idea that we're all in this together and we have to work together to find solutions.
Janse, I'd also like to hear from you on how you think the last 18 months has changed the way that we think about this Nexus approach.
Yes, I think the biggest thing that COVID-19 and the pandemic and the lockdown has shown us is the vulnerability in our system. I think that certainly came to the fore right at the beginning. It's coming to the fore more and more now. Our unemployment is increasing. Our ability to pay and afford those very basic services and commodities that we rely on to live are becoming more and more inaccessible to people. I think that's the biggest thing that we've learned. The system is under stress. And while we're talking, I made this note. You can see it, and we've been seeing it for a long time, that something is simply not right. And I think it's not so much the planning. I think it's the way we're thinking and the way we're interacting with one another. And I think that's probably the most valuable input and contribution that whole system, and particularly water, energy, food nexus thinking, can bring to addressing these issues. And not only COVID, I think there's a host of other issues that we faced with in South Africa that requires this integrated thinking of dealing with issues.
And Dr. Nohamo, I know at some point there was some concern about the virus being spread through water sources, and I think that also made us think a lot more about the safety of the water that we have access to. At the Water Research Commission, how has the pandemic directed possible research that you will be conducting in the future?
Yes, Janine, thank you for that. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has ushered us into the fourth industrial revolution. And obviously, what the scientists, researchers have been saying all along, that we should change the way we do things, the age has arrived. This is the now. We need to move very fast. And of course, the pandemic has shown, in fact, the United Nations Youth Fund, which was launched during the peak of the COVID-19, over $40 billion have been raised so far. If you read the document, the emphasis, we actually wrote a paper on that, on the Web Nexus, water, energy, water, health, environment, and nutrition nexus. The United Nations report actually emphasizes on integration, and the word nexus there appears so many times. We need to integrate these issues if we are going to achieve something better, and not only focus on health issues, but we have seen that it has some ripple effects as well. And yes, at the Water Research Commission, we've got another key strategic area that deals on sanitation, and they have developed some indicators already through the University of KwaZulu-Natal, not through Professor Mabaodi, but I don't remember. Professor Mabaodi should know where the Professor Dr. Noshansha has, through his team at UKZN, they've developed some indicators on which they can show how water has also contributed to the spread of the virus, and also through wastewater. You can actually know that in Tswane there's COVID-19. It may not be reported, but you could tell through waste. Yes, we have already developed that. I think Professor Mabaodi is aware of such a project. It's not being done by him, but some other department. Thank you.
So yeah, so if we come to you, Professor Mabaodi, and then again, I think that if we reflect on these sustainable development goals that that you also mentioned in your presentation, and in the context of the Water-Energy-Food Nexus, has it changed sort of the urgency of some of these sustainable development goals, having gone through the COVID pandemic and living through the past 18 months, and where we've really seen that we've sort of gone backwards on some of what has already been achieved in terms of these goals. So do you think then that we will see a renewed urgency on maybe different aspects that would have been more urgent before the pandemic?
Yeah, definitely COVID has changed the landscape. And from a research perspective, it's changed the landscape in terms of funding. The priorities for funding have changed overnight. A lot of funders, they went and rewrote their strategies and their priorities. Where funding for health had been declining, it has suddenly become a priority. In terms of the WEF Nexus, the region SADC that has been championing the Water-Energy-Food Nexus in Southern Africa has also come back to say, we realized that the WEF is not resilient to a health pandemic. So whilst we had thought of it from a natural resources perspective and had not really factored in health, we need to factor in a health component into our assessment of the WEF Nexus as both a driver and an outcome. So it just shows you that the landscape has shifted. So things that were not sitting high on the priority list, several SDGs that were not very high, are going to become, or priorities shifting in favor of them. At the same time, several SDGs have suffered because the pot remains the same. So there's no new money that has emerged. It's just the reprioritization of existing funds. So even here in South Africa, when we announced, the support last year from government, we later on found, through the various departments that we collaborate with, that certain projects that had been earmarked to happen could no longer happen because the funds had been reallocated to COVID relief and so forth. So in some areas, we have taken some steps back and also been impacted by the reallocation of resources. In some areas, we have taken a move forward because of the reallocation of resources to drive those areas. I think what is needed post-COVID, the World Economic Forum tried to do it last year with their, meeting titled The Great Reset. There's a need for a reset of some sort, but there's a need for meaningful engagement in terms of how do we move forward. Because we can either move forward on the basis of panic, which is where we are, which is more responsive and not very proactive. Or we can, take a moment of retrospect and to introspect and then reassess what our priorities are. There are things that have emerged that we did not think were problematic in South Africa before, but COVID came and showed the depth of the problems. So there's a need for us to introspect as a country and reestablish new priorities if we are going to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And the target is not to achieve some of the SDGs. They were not designed in that context, where you want to achieve some. They are integrated goals where you need to achieve all of them. And that is where Nexus approaches including the Water-Energy-Food Nexus, that encourage a holistic and systematic way of thinking can become very useful in informing how do we move forward in a way that will help us achieve those interlinked sustainable development goals.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. I've just got two more questions that I quickly want to get to before we wrap up. And the first one is the presentations really do paint quite a worrying picture about the current state of our resources, especially water and energy. And I mean, even though we are food secure on a national level, we do have quite a high level of household food insecurity. And so at the moment, we're already staring a severe water crisis in the face, looking at about a 2% deficit in water availability in South Africa as soon as 2040, 2050. Do we still have time to really change this trajectory before we enter sort of a full-blown crisis phase where even more than now we face national shortages of water? I want to start with you on that, Dr. Nohamu from the Water Research Commission. Just how serious is this crisis, and can we turn it around before it hits?
Okay, thanks, Janine. Yeah, we don't want to cause alarm nor to cause panic. And South Africa is not peculiar, is not the only country going through such challenges. These challenges, these challenges do not know any borders. And most of the challenges, especially if we consider climate change, yes, we are saying 86% of our energy resources are coming from coal. But if you find the main culprits is the Western world. Those are the countries that are causing it. If you look at China as the West country that is causing some of these climate change challenges. It's not yet gloom, but the time of action is now. We need to act now. There have been challenges of the police was saying there's no evidence, there's no empirical evidence. We are just talking of the Water-Energy-Food Nexus, and there were some issues related to the water energy. Some of our policy and decision makers thought maybe we were advocating for a mega wave nexus department in South Africa, and people were afraid of losing their jobs. No, we are not saying that. The Water-Energy-Food Nexus is simply a platform of engagement to work together and see. We still need the water department, we still need the agriculture department, we still need the energy department, we need them. But the Wave Nexus is just there as a stakeholder engagement platform. There is still an opportunity to improve if we adopt what science is saying. I can give an example. Some 12 years ago, the energy challenges that we are facing today, they were being said, if we don't do anything, we're going to face energy crisis. And politicians are politicians. I'm not trying to cause an alarm, but look at the situation today. It's not good. The time of action is now. Thank you, Danny.
I'll move on to you, Professor Midgley, just in terms of how urgent is it that we act, and is there still time to act?
I agree with Dr. Nama that I wouldn't call it a crisis, but if we do not act urgently, it will be a crisis quite soon. So we have absolutely no time to waste. The good side of that is that a lot of the solutions, in many cases, the technologies, the tools are available, and we need to just harness them. So if I can just maybe point out that of the three components, water, energy, food. In fact, energy is a potentially unlimited resource. The sun is an unlimited, the wind is an unlimited resource. If we think of energy constraints, we think of fossil fuels, but if we could harness, and the planning and the policies are falling into place now, eventually after many years, we're starting to see movement where the massive rollout of renewable energy technologies is feasible in the near term. And I think that is a great reason for hope. And when we have energy, we can also use energy to create more water. We can treat wastewater, we can treat saline water. There are all sorts of things we can do once we have energy. And energy is spread around the whole country. It's not limited to a catchment or a city or farmlands. It is anywhere where there's sun and wind, and our rural communities could really, really benefit. We could create a lot of employment. I'm thinking of agri-processing, where with the same land and the same water, we can grow things that we then beneficiate, we add value using energy, and that way we create jobs. So we have to be clever about thinking about this. And for me, the renewable energy side is the big, the hopeful one, but we do have to act and put that into place very quickly. I would say we've got maybe a decade to really make big strides there.
Okay, thanks. Professor Mabaodi, some input from you?
Yeah, I think just to add to what my colleagues have said, people have called these challenges wicked problems. That's one, phrase that has been used, and that just shows you that they are not, of course we don't want to use the word crisis, but they are wicked problems. And what makes them wicked is that they are systematic, they are interlinked, and what has become obvious is they cannot be solved from the traditional sector-based approaches. And this much we know. And the advantage that we have in this generation in time is never before have we had so much access to information and so much access to technology. And never have societies been so interlinked and connected as we are today. So the movement of solutions and knowledge across borders and oceans is so fast, it's instant. So it means our capabilities and capacities to solve the problems that we face, the so-called wicked problems, are actually at the highest they've ever been in terms of human history. What we need is the will and the motivation to do so. And that calls for leadership. So there's need for a new type of leadership across all sectors of society, science, and so forth, that looks at the challenges that we have differently and approaches them with a sense of renewed energy. That's what I would conclude by saying.
And Jens, I would like to hear your thoughts on this, especially from the agricultural perspective. I know that the panel members have very carefully tried to steer us away from talking about a crisis, but certainly for many agricultural communities and rural communities, that word would be very appropriate to describe the realities that they've been facing for the last 3 years.
Absolutely. And again, being in such erudite company, I'm also going to be hesitant in using the word crisis. But two examples are clear indications of something coming down the track that we should all be extremely worried about. Our National Water and Sanitation Master Plan in South Africa talks about a 17% deficit in available water for human life in South Africa by 2030, as soon as 2030. That's 9 years away from where we are now. Again, it's not about that what we know and what we don't know. We know this problem is there. It's about how we're thinking about it, how we're ultimately going to respond to that. And this is where I think a model such as Water-Energy-Food Nexus thinking comes into play so importantly. We need to start thinking about these things differently, and we need to start thinking about it very quickly. I'm also going to be hesitant in using the word crisis because we don't have a choice. We simply have to face these challenges and we have to overcome them. That is a survival question, so important. But yes, we have serious cause for concern in South Africa about especially our water resources and particularly our energy resources. I don't think we have to go into too much further detail about where we see Eskom standing at the moment, but this is causing enormous multifaceted problems, including increased unemployment, poverty, and inequality.
Thanks. I've got one more question from one of our audience members that I'm going to give this to you, Dr. Naamu, to handle, and then after that I'll come to a final question that will also give all of our presenters a chance to just give final comments and to wrap up. So the question is that with 98% of water allocated, how much of this allocated water can actually be delivered through existing infrastructure? And then the second part of the question looks at if we do need new infrastructure and the development of new irrigation schemes, for example, who will pay for this? And as the question concludes, then that people do want to adapt, they do want to innovate, but it's often the cost of innovation that's challenging.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, it's known that 90% of our available freshwater resources are already allocated. Yeah, in terms of infrastructure, I think we will go back to resource use efficiency, to use our resources as much efficiently as possible. And at the same time, it is known that South Africa is the country with the most dam density in the world, followed by Zimbabwe. I was reading recently, there's no more room, I'm sure, to dam with the existing water already. So we need to utilize what we have at the moment. And another solution, as I said, is to go for groundwater. In South Africa, we know cities that are depending entirely on groundwater, but we don't know how much groundwater we have and how much we are affecting it. And almost every household in low density suburbs where I sit as well, there's a borehole. So yeah, through infrastructure, we need, policy has to do something, and we still have to pay for it. We are the people, we are the South Africans. Who else can pay for it if we don't? We are the people. We pay tax. It's your money, taxpayers' money. Everyone must get involved in this. It's not only this donor dependency. I'm totally against it because it's not good. It's us who are responsible for our own things. Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, so you're saying that we must really just make sure that more money is made available through the fiscus to support these innovations and developments.
Yes, I believe that. That's what I want. If someone wants to come, if Bill Gates wants to come with his monies, unconditionally, there's no problem. But these conditions, they are also very clever there. There are good terms and conditions attached. But that is a personal opinion. Okay.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to do the final question. And as you answer, you're also welcome to wrap up and give any final comments. And I do want to end on a positive note. And Professor Midgley, you've already mentioned some of these low-hanging fruit, for example, appointing, filling those vacancies that we have at the municipal and provincial level, and also in terms of training. But I want to follow up on that and ask, in addition to that, what are some of the easy wins and the low-hanging fruit that can see South Africa make really meaningful progress over the next 3 to say 5 years, to set the country on a better course for sustainable food, energy, and water security? I'm going to start with you, Professor Mabaodi, and then work through the panel from there.
Okay, thank you. So it's not all dark and gloomy. There's a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. As I said, the challenges that we face are immense, but our potential to innovate and come up with solutions is also at its peak. What we need is more coordination, or better coordination and collaboration. And I speak to both coordination and collaboration because they refer to totally different things. We often have platforms for coordination, but we do not have means for collaboration. Now, collaboration is what actually brings on board partnership and resource sharing and co-implementation. And that is what we need to address the issues. So whilst the WEF Nexus conceptualization and tools and so forth can help us understand, so it is still very theoretical, in that it is just helping us to understand. It can pinpoint where the problems are. It can identify areas for intervention, but interventions need to have a coordinated and collaborative approach. So we need to see different sectors coming together to work together in coming up with solutions. We need to also understand that what underpins all of these things, as I said, is the need to achieve sustainable human and environmental health and well-being at the end of it. So it's about people and nature at the end of it, and how we manage resources to sustain people and nature for posterity's sake. And it calls for all of us. So science has the tools, the knowledge is being generated, but there's need for proper mechanisms for coordination and collaboration. We need the private sector to come in, as you have today as Agri-SA, in facilitating this sort of discussions. And these are the spaces that we need, where researchers like myself are coming in and interacting with people across industry and sharing the knowledge that is there. And industry can challenge the applicability of our knowledge. We've got policymakers, Stephanie sits in a practitioner policy sort of space. We need those, they are here today. They can come and tell us what the priorities are and where the gaps are. So then that is when we have what we call transdisciplinarity, when you've got the science matching with the needs of the policy and the practitioners. That's what I would conclude on. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll move on to you next, Prof. Midgley, for your concluding remarks, and then also if you want to add to any of those low-hanging fruit that you've already mentioned.
I think one of the easier things we can do, and we can start with that immediately, is to do more with what we already have. So what we already have in terms of human resources, of natural resources, of infrastructure, and even while we are trying to plan and invest in build and new infrastructure, new technologies, while we wait for that to come online, we do need to do more with what we have. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities. There is still a lot of wastage in the system. I think earlier somebody referred to where in agriculture there are still areas of wasteful water use in irrigation, and of leakages of pipes, infrastructure, that dams that are leaking a lot of water. A lot of water we have is just disappearing and is not being used productively. So, and then of course there's food wastage, and we're using precious land and water and energy to produce the food, and then 40% of it is never eaten, and that is shocking. Yeah. So I think that is the low-hanging fruit. When we work on that immediately, it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. Those are often behavioral prioritization changes rather than big investments. And then at the same time, we bring in the investment for the longer term as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Over to you, Dr. Namu, for some final observations.
Yes, Denini, thank you very much. I cannot believe more with my colleagues. What they've said is the correct thing. We need coordination. We need to adopt what our scientists are saying. We need to develop capacity. And the time to act is now. We don't need to wait for tomorrow. And Denini, in your opening remarks, you mentioned something that I liked very much. There are still skeptics around there about this wild concept called Water-Energy-Food Nexus. And you actually said that by the end of this webinar, maybe you understand what the concept is all about. Now I want to pose a question back to you. I've been asking everyone else a question. Do you now understand what the Water-Energy-Food Nexus is? That's my concluding remark.
Thanks for the question. It has definitely helped me develop a better understanding of the different linkages. And I think, as I also said to you when we had our first meeting about this, for me, the connection between food and water is very obvious and apparent. But what has been really interesting for me is to learn more about the role that energy plays in all of this, and to see it as not just something that we must look at separately, but something that is very much integral to these other two factors within the Nexus approach. And yeah, as I also said in my opening remarks, that the more that we think about it, the more we understand that it really is actually an intuitive way of thinking. And I think we do understand as humans that there is a greater interconnectedness in the world we live in. And certainly this is maybe one of the lessons that the pandemic has helped us to learn. I'm just going to say a quick thank you from me, and then I'm going to hand over to Janse to give his final comments, and then also to close this webinar for us with his final remarks. So thank you so much to all the panelists for the presentations and the time that you took to prepare those, to really present what can be quite a complex topic in a way that made it accessible, and that made it so that we could learn from it and walk away with some new ideas, and also with some questions to ponder further and to go and seek answers for. And also thank you from me to Agri SA for partnering with Farmers Weekly for this webinar. We were very happy to take part in this, and to my team here at Farmers Weekly, Reinhard Lotz and Sandira Chetty, who's working behind the scenes, handling all the technical aspects. Thank you for your time and your effort, and for handling it so well. And then over to you, Janse. I'll leave it to you to close the webinar for us.
Janine, thank you, and thank you to you and your team in particular for the excellent professional way in which you've managed this webinar, and also for the access that it's given a lot of people that might normally not have access to Agri SA's platforms to be able to talk about this. One of the comments, I couldn't agree more. This has really been a bit of an enlightenment moment for me in many ways. This idea of it's not what we know, but how we think about things and how we respond to it is such an important way in which we can address some of South Africa's most pressing challenges, and not only the agricultural ones, also the larger ones. The low-hanging fruit question that you posed, it also set me thinking, we have so many things that we share with one another, and I think there's nothing like a good crisis or a threat to unify people. But we need to formulate a unified resolve amongst all players in society to be able to address all these things in a new way of thinking, which really takes into account not only what we know, also the complexities of what we're facing, but also the way that we interact with one another and how we interact with nature. I think that to me is one of the biggest important lessons. The other important thing that I do think that we should all take away from this, and particularly organizations such as Agri SA, is that we often fall into silo thinking. We have centers of excellence within Agri SA that should be working probably a little bit closer to each other to address some of these issues. So private sector needs to make sure that it gets together and thinks about these things differently too. We often blame government for ineffective and inadequate service delivery and so, but from our side, we also need to make sure that in a unified way, we address things holistically. And that's almost a double whammy in many senses. Having said that, and in concluding, thank you so much to all the guests. I think you've acquitted yourself excellently on a tough topic. It's a complex thing to get your head around. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for your time. And thank you to all the guests and participants this morning, today, that attended. I think it's certainly been of great value to all of us. With that, I'd like to conclude and say goodbye to everybody. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.